Hey, what's up, everybody? We have a new YouTube channel. Make sure you subscribe right now. Leave a comment on the video. Share it with your friends. It's also a podcast, 3 and Out, wherever you listen with me, John Middlekauff, Apple, Spotify. We have you covered, as well as thevolume.com. We have merch. Check out. I got 3 and Out hats right now. Thevolume.com. Search the podcast. Buy some merch.
We just watched Michigan throttle Washington 34-13. I was pulling, for Washington for reasons because John had a lot of money on it, and I am from the Pacific Northwest. But I had said with John and on FS1 and Fox Sports Radio, I thought Michigan really matched up with Washington well. I thought their secondary would clamp down. They'd get a pass rush. You saw it tonight. Recruiting does matter, and Michigan recruits at a higher level. One of the limitations for Washington has always been they are geographically jammed up in the corner. Washington, Oregon, Idaho do not have a lot of Division I players. They have to convince kids to come up to the rainy weather. Michigan, more centrally located, and sometimes it's a little bit easier in the region they're in to recruit. I mean, Oregon and Washington play at a very high level and sort of overcome some recruiting disadvantages. NIL certainly helps Oregon because of Phil Knight and his backing. But my takeaway to start this game was that, listen, Michigan felt they were going to pound them a little bit on the run. Washington was aggressive defensively, got burned. But I think in the end, Washington averaged 4 yards a play. Michigan averaged 7.8, and they just negated Washington's firepower. Washington has thrown the ball on everybody for 2 years. And Michigan's corners and pass rush just took it away. And then you had a very limited Michael Penix, who doesn't move particularly well, and a run game that was never great all season. I kind of felt like I knew who was going to win this thing about 8 minutes into it. I had like a feeling like, they're just going to lean on Washington. That was my takeaway.
Yeah, I mean, it was 17-10 right at halftime, but
Right.
It felt more like 30-3. I mean, It was Washington was very, very lucky, which you felt like had some momentum because they were going into half, they were getting the ball, and then he immediately comes out and throws an interception. But in that third quarter, I mean, Michigan couldn't get anything going on offense. They only gave up 3 points, so it was 20-10 going into the fourth quarter. But Michigan is about to set the record, many people believe, for players drafted, and it's not super high end talent. It's 15 to 17 guys that are going to get drafted. A lot of guys 3rd, 4th, 5th round, and it showed tonight. Right, Washington's talent, NFL-wise, is all the skill guys on offense. The receivers, Odunze, the other 2 guys, and the quarterback. Well, if I tell you the quarterback, I would say has one of the worst games you've ever seen him play that mattered. Not some of the Stanford or the random games against Oregon, against the big-time teams they've played, Texas. I'd give him like a C- tonight. They have no chance. And then the other thing that really stood out is Washington's offensive line, won the Joe Moore Award, they got worked. I mean, that guard and center combination was getting shoved around. The physicality, you saw Harbaugh's team look like the good NFL teams. They're just good at every position. They tackle well. And to me, the player of the game is Harbaugh's defensive coordinator, Jesse Minter, which I'm sure would go with him. He's a Raven guy to the NFL. What a performance by him. I mean, shutting down one of the more explosive offenses we've seen in recent memory.
Yeah, I mean, Penix had an off game. I kind of look at it like it's not a random off game. He got pressure, not a lot of space to move, and people weren't open. And so he was off because he was pressured. He was off because there just weren't a lot of openings. I mean, you and I both thought Washington matched up really well with Texas. I thought it was like, that matches up. Texas weak in the secondary. Michigan's got NFL guys in the secondary. So
everywhere.
Penix was just throwing that ball. It was sort of jump ball situations. And I mean, Michael Penix is still going to get drafted very high, but you can see the concerns about him. He is sort of a statuesque thrower. He kind of lets it fly. So he doesn't like to get hit. You saw a couple times when he had pressure, he didn't want to get popped. And in the NFL, if you go to a bad team, you're going to get popped. So you watch a Josh Allen on Sunday or a Lamar, and they can throw, they can pass. Michael's going to sit in the pocket in the NFL like Tua, and he's going to throw the football. I think he's a bigger, stronger Tua, throws it up the sideline better than Tua, but that's sort of his comp. He's kind of a statuesque thrower when he has time to throw. Does it hurt his draft stock? Certainly didn't help it. You're a former scout. I mean, people are saying he'll drop out of the first round. I think there's so much desperation for a quarterback. He may go down to 2025, but it doesn't feel like he'd go mid-second, does it?
No, I mean, maybe I'm a little biased, living on the West Coast and rooting for them. And maybe I got a little overexcited for the Texas game because I like to ask my friends that are on teams that don't need a quarterback. So when they go into these schools, they have no agenda in evaluating the guy. And a couple of guys that are, scouting directors had second round grades on the guy. And a lot of people were pushing back against this top 10 talk after the Texas game because they go, he's an older player. He's been banged up. Look at tonight. It looked a lot like some of those Oregon games where he's getting peppered and you go, God, is he going to be able to get up? Well, what happens when that's TJ Watt, right? Or Fletcher Cox or Aaron Donald, those guys leaning on him all game long. So I understand the concerns. I'm bullish on him. I like him. Tonight is rough because the way you evaluate a player is against the best competition he plays, right? So Oregon, Texas defensively is not, right? Yeah. So tonight would be the game that if you were feeling pretty good about your second round grade, which I understand. Like I understand the concerns, but I don't think you got to be careful in scouting about overreacting to a performance like tonight because to me, he was really amped up early. He could never get into a rhythm and he was bad. I mean, guys have bad games, right? So I wouldn't write the guy off, but tonight is definitely going to be of concern in these draft meetings for these teams. Like you said, I would be like, I don't see him falling out of the first round, all the character stuff. The medical is going to be a concern. And when he goes to the combine, if anything, red flags with the knees, just the wear and tear on the body, because you draft a guy in the first round, it is about the second contract. Like, can the guy be an 8-9 year player? Do we feel comfortable about giving the guy a second contract? And I do think tonight brought up some fair questions there. I still like the player, but tonight was a rough performance.
Yeah. I mean, it was, as I was watching the game, I said, you have two contrasting styles, a team that would prefer to throw, a team that would prefer to run, a West Coast Pac-12 team, a Big Ten team. Michigan made it look like a Big Ten game. Michigan made that game look like they wanted to make it look. McCarthy didn't have to throw much, a couple of big throws to the tight end, take a lead, physically push Washington around. As Washington, now heads into the conference, Michigan's like, okay, this is what we do. This is sort of what the kind of brand of football. Yeah. I mean, Michigan doesn't have an elite receiver. Their tight end's one of their more consistent pass catchers. So I thought Michigan made it look like a Big Ten game. And the other thing that jumped out to me, and Michigan, for the record, is a very good tackling team. You pointed that out. Sometimes you have to watch a moment. You can speculate and then you watch a moment. And I was like, I don't know. I think Harbaugh is going to come back to Michigan. As I watched that game and I watched the way Michigan played, I'm like, yeah, this would be the perfect time to leave. Like it was, I sat there and I'm like, he beat Washington, Alabama, Ohio State, Iowa, Penn State in a row. It's your last 5 games at Michigan. And you see his brother and you see the family. And I thought, he's going to take his DC. All these kids are leaving. And as I watched it, it's weird, but it felt like his last game at Michigan. Does that sound crazy?
Yeah, he's gone. I mean, I think he's definitely gone. And the one thing Jim Harbaugh has always done, and it was on full display tonight, is his coaching staffs are so good. I remember going to a Niner practice when he was there, and it was Vic Fangio as defensive coordinator who was with him at Stanford. Feels like he has a young superstar in this Jesse Minter guy that he got from his brother. Previously, he had McDonald, that is now his brother's defensive coordinator. The Harbaugh skills of accumulating excellent assistants is an elite skill because Jim is a CEO head coach. He's not calling the plays. He's a motivator. He's a program guy. That team felt like an NFL team today, the way they tackled, their physicality, their relentlessness. And listen, Washington's like a really good college team. That felt like we're good at everywhere. Our only flaw is our quarterback. How much can we rely on him? But he's clearly has NFL potential. We can talk about him from an NFL standpoint, but Harbaugh has built teams like this when he's been at his best, where he's a heavyweight fighter and he comes in. I mean, what they have almost 180 yards rushing in the first quarter. They hit him like Mike Tyson right in the face, and it felt like it really wobbled Washington, and they were never the same after that. They were just holding on by a thread, and because Harbaugh's teams typically, unless they're playing crappy opponents, aren't going to score 60 points. You're always going to be in the game, especially they were bad on third down, but the game was never close. The score was close. The game wasn't close.
Yeah, again, Michigan averaged 8 yards a play, Washington 4. And the game looked like Michigan wanted it to look like. It was a Big Ten football game.
One thing we were talking before you hopped on is I remember during the Super Bowl, Jim was very uncomfortable playing his brother because Jim likes to view the opponent as an enemy.
Yeah, that's
And,
right. Yeah.
so going to the AFC, if he goes to the Chargers or the Raiders, his mindset's going to be a good playoff team. Well, he's going to have to see the Ravens. Do you think that could maybe force him to be more interested in Washington, Atlanta, maybe take Tepper's call seriously to just avoid his brother? Because that family is a very tight-knit group. It felt like a Harbaugh family reunion there tonight.
Well, I mean, his brother coaches in Baltimore. I could see Jim taking the Washington job. I mean, it's just right across the river. Yeah, I mean, there is a reality about the NFL. It's like you start looking at these playoff teams, there's just not a lot of bad quarterbacks. I mean, it's Dak and Hurts. I mean, a low-end guy is Baker, and then it's Goff, and then it's Stafford. CJ Stroud.
Washington has the second pick, so he would be able to pick basically his quarterback beside Caleb Williams.
Well, he wouldn't take Penix because he went against him and saw flaws. He's not going to get Caleb, although they may make a run and move up. Depends on what, Chicago, I don't trust their front office. They may move down to second and take a boatload of picks. I think that's an interesting point. I know the Chargers, Albert Breer has said this, and I've been told the same thing through my sources. The Chargers they realize what's happening in the Los Angeles market. McVay, once again, over-delivers. Lincoln Riley is a name. LeBron. I mean, the Clippers have 4 stars. Look at what the Dodgers are bringing in. It's a really distracted market. And if you can't go with another coordinator. Dan Quinn's not going to move the interest meter in this town. Mike Vrabel a little, Jim Harbaugh a lot. So, but you have new owners in Washington, and they're wealthier than the Spanos family, who I don't even think they're middle of the pack in NFL owner wealth. I think they're, as Mark Cuban says, poor billionaires club in pro sports. So, I mean, the Washington one's very, very interesting. I like Washington's talent. I think Sam Howell's a backup. But you could certainly, that's an advantage. Jim Harbaugh may see that as hey, I don't have an incumbent. Sam Howell can start, and by November 1st, we're bringing the kid in, a Drake May. So I think it has to be considered. But I'll say it again. I really did feel watching this game in the second half. I'm like, yeah, this is it. This feels like it's it. Jim has coached on the West Coast and likes it. But the Harbaughs, they kind of feel Midwest. They kind of, it kind of feels like they're part of the country. So we know he's probably not going to Chicago because of the president and he don't get along. And by the way, Kalen DeBoer for Washington will be at the top of Michigan's list. I mean, that's the story that'll develop 3 or 4 days from now. Michigan is going to go after Washington's coach.
Well, I talked about on the podcast today, look at Washington and connect the dots. Their owner, his last 2 coaches as a Sixer owner were Doc Rivers and Nick Nurse, 2 championship level big names, very expensive. Bob Myers, when they had to go get a coach, what did he do? They went after Steve Kerr. What's he always done? Big game hunting in Golden State. Spielman, Rick, who I think is a pretty good GM. I mean, I think the guy should get a second chance to be a GM. What is he like? Physical football. Mike Zimmer. Right, the way they played in Minnesota all those years. Seems like Jim Harbaugh's his type guy. So I think you start connecting the dots. I didn't even think about they're right down the road from each other in Baltimore. He can bring his parents. You get to be around both families. Makes a lot of sense. But there was a lot of reporting today. Arthur Blank's 81 years old. He's got a ton of money. He's going to go big game hunting. I think Harbaugh, you said it yesterday when we were talking that he's not going to interview with 10 jobs. But there are going to be some of these owners that are going to be aggressive for him are going to be very aggressive. And the money is not going to be an issue for them. So these numbers are going to be really high. They're going to have no problem cutting an enormous check to just get the sit down. Like, Jim, we're prepared. We just want to get a yes from you. So Arthur Blank, Josh Harris, I think these people. So when we talk about the Spanoses, for the first time, really in the modern age, they're going to have to, if they want to match these guys, because they do have the money if they want to match them, but their mentality is going to have to be aggression, which we could argue has not really ever been their thing, where Josh Harris is used to that. right? He's been in the NBA a lot where you got to go big game hunting. Clearly gets rid of Ron Rivera a lot, brings in Bob Myers. Or like this guy's very
Yeah.
forward thinking 2024. Can Dean, and again, Mark Davis already has a relationship with Jim. And we talked about this. He's cut $100 million check 6 years ago to John Gruden. So there are going to be 4 or 5 teams willing to cut enormous amounts of money toward Jim. It's just going to be his preference. And I think Washington definitely has a lot to offer when you factor in the draft capital.
Yeah, and I think Jim, who is, it's a big advantage wherever Jim goes. He's going to want some, some personnel power. He's probably recruited Drake May. So, for him, it's like, who do I like more, Drake May or Herbert? I mean, he may look at that and think, well, Herbert's getting paid. I get 4 to 5 years of Drake May. I could see absolutely him saying, listen, I'm the third coach for Herbert. Like the first 2 didn't work. If the kid's special, some of these guys should work. So, the Washington one's really interesting. And, right now Jim lives in Ann Arbor and his, mom and dad live right next door.
Yeah.
So I think that's bigger than people think. I think the ability to have the Harbaughs in DC and Baltimore, I think that's a real thing. I could see that family saying, we don't want to make mom and dad fly out west, get on a plane, fly. They can just drive back and forth, get them a driver. They don't have to do all the DC driving. I mean, that's a real discussion. I could see that family having. And again, Washington has the most cap space, the number 2 pick, a serviceable quarterback in Sam Howell. He's serviceable, no pressure to play him. And again, I think their roster is pretty solid.
When everyone thought Alex Smith was one of the biggest busts of all time, Jim Harbaugh during the lockout convinced him to come back and immediately won games for a year and a half with him before he got that concussion. Look who he just won a national championship with. I mean, essentially a college game manager. Now, I know he has NFL prospects, physical skills, but he doesn't play like that in college. So Jim doesn't look at it like I need Lamar Jackson or Josh Allen to win. That's not the way he's wired, the way he coaches football, because his mentality is we're going to build a dominant defense. Washington has some players on defense, and he knows, like you said, recruited all these guys. They're going to have money to buy the guys. And offensively, it's in modern times a little bit of an archaic style, but it always works for Jim, right? It's worked for him for now 15 years.
McCarthy doesn't work for me. You know how like Russell Wilson got smaller quarterbacks drafted. The opposite, the inverse could be true, where a smaller quarterback fails and people are like, whoa, whoa, whoa. When I watch McCarthy, he weighs about 200 pounds.
Max.
He feels, max. He just feels too slight. I watch Bryce Young and I'm like, he just doesn't look the part. JJ McCarthy looks like a little taller version of Bryce Young, where he's just not thick through the hips. It's like he looks slight, like he's going to have to really, to get to 202. You start watching Josh Allen on Sunday night and you start watching these star quarterbacks, like they carry 230, 235, Manning, Brady, even Aaron Rodgers is like 227 and he looks slender. So if you're battling to stay above 200, and he's athletic, but he's not hyper athletic. He's not Kyler Murray. He's not making people miss. I don't think McCarthy to me is like a 3rd round quarterback. I don't really get it.
Totally agree. I mean, all this hype about him being a top 10 prospect is insanity to me. To me, he looks like a 2nd-day player for sure, and a guy that can't play right away in the NFL. One, he hasn't been asked to play like that in college. Well, in the NFL, you have to make throws on 3rd down, which they try to avoid at all costs. Look at the way they played tonight. They tried, and they have, and you can make the argument, well, that's how they play. I think they're a little uncomfortable with having to lean on him, where Washington's the opposite. They have to lean on their quarterback, and as he's off, they're screwed, where they don't have to. But I'm with you. He obviously has a live arm, and he's a good athlete. But to me, the frame, very thin. And I under no circumstances could I take him in the 1st round over what he's done in college. Doesn't mean he can't develop over time. Ideally, to me, he's drafted on the 2nd day, gets to kind of sit, get bigger, and kind of progress. Jimmy Garoppolo, a lot of players, they get drafted on the 2nd day, don't have to play right away. Maybe you go to a better situation and you get behind, a guy that's already a starter, and you kind of work your way in. But this talk about him being a high 1st round pick, I think that's a little bit of the media, college football hype machine.
Yeah, I think we're going to have Caleb Williams, Drake May, Jaden Daniels feel like top 10. Bo Nix will be somewhere like 11 to 16. I think I saw Bo play twice live. There's a little Drew Brees, high accuracy. He's athletic. He's pretty cut. He's more athletic than people think, but he doesn't feel like a top 6, 7 pick. So, okay, so we both sort of agree. I think we both agree Harbaugh's off to the NFL. I think you've convinced me Washington could have a slight edge. You know, in that division, it's interesting too. So in that division, I mean, you got to think about everything. Although Harbaugh wouldn't probably spend much time on this, Mike McCarthy, Nick Sirianni, right?
Dayball's
Harbaugh.
defensive coordinator just quit.
I mean, saw Wink Martindale.
The Giants have a lot of issues. I was told, and I said this on the pod a month and a half ago, the coaches didn't like him. And I thought Dayball was really good last year, but they have had a lot of strife internally. And there was a lot of talk, everything's fine, everything's fine. Well, one of the best assets on the coaching staff was like, I'm out. Quit, which is not normal. I mean, that's a huge red flag. He wasn't fired. He said, I want out. You know, so the Dayball situation, let's face it, offensively, they haven't really been explosive. They're tied to Daniel Jones, and now they lose their defensive coordinator. They've been excellent on defense. I mean, last year they made the playoffs because it's not like they were scoring a lot of points. So I would say the Giants are very, very in flux. The Eagles, we've never seen a 10-1 team leak oil like them. And the Cowboys, you can feel the pressure building, right? Every playoff game, if something gets weird, Jerry's getting older, is liable to do something crazy. Even he didn't really give him the ringing endorsement going into the playoffs, right? We'll see what happens. So I think Washington, I still think the Raiders are, you know, the history of football means something to Jim. You know, you get a blank slate. Like you said, the Chargers isn't necessarily a blank slate. You get Herbert, but there is a lot of other stuff going on.
And they have some cap space issues.
Yeah.
You've got to move off some people there. Washington's got the most cap space. There's a romance about the Raiders. I just seen so many coaches fail there. After a while, it feels like there's a systemic problem beyond just like the helmet and the logo.
Totally
like Mark
agree.
Davis is one of the poorest owners, and it's you know, they've made some bad decisions on personnel, head coaching, GM. So I think I'd pass on that.
Yeah, I would too. I just think Jim's crazy enough to be connected there, which I believe. And I think it's fair to say it wouldn't shock me if he doesn't even pick up David Tepper's call at this point in time. That organization's got a lot of issues, a lot of questions, and it doesn't really feel like Bryce Young would be. I mean, Jim would have him by about 5 inches and 45 pounds. So it doesn't seem like he'd be that interested in that quarterback.